Appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit, and probably less about Mid-American Energy Company today and more about Berkshire Hathaway Energy Wind. And as we go through the presentation, really want to cover three items and review how the company is structured, number one, from BHE Renewables, BHE Wind, and then our affiliates, Mid-American Energy Company. Look at the importance actually in estimating the accuracy of the local impacts and how that carries over into the ability to communicate to the local public on the benefits that wind can bring. Look at methods to estimate economic impacts, and then really run through the impacts that we've seen at our 400 megawatt project in Polk County, Nebraska. So a little bit of background about Berkshire Hathaway Energy Company. Really are a worldwide energy company. As we look at the company, we have electric distribution in the UK, about 240 megawatts of hydro in the Philippines. And then we also have gas pipeline companies, probably familiar with Northern Natural Gas, and then we also have a bullet gas transmission pipeline from the Rockies down to Southern California. And then we also have the platforms of three vertically integrated utilities, which would be the Pacific Corp utilities in the Northwest, Utah, Idaho, and Wyoming. NV Energy, which is the largest rate-regulated utility in the state of Nevada. And then the company that a lot of folks here, I think, in Nebraska are familiar with is Mid-American Energy Company, which is the largest rate-regulated utility in the state of Iowa. And that's really, as David pointed out, where I grew up in the renewables business, and really started back in 2003 with what I think was a great vision of Governor Vilsack at that point in time with the public-private partnership, and what was it going to take to really develop the wind industry in that state. And as we look at Iowa, the one thing that really boosted in the growth at that point in time from 2003 until 2012, when I actually left Mid-American and joined BHE Wind, was a legislative change that, number one, allowed Mid-American Energy Company to own and operate utility or wind generation projects, and then number two, actually allowed wind to be covered under what we call prescriptive rate-making principles, which actually allowed us to go to the Iowa Utilities Board, come up with our project estimates, and get a pre-approval effectively to build the projects as we went through that rate-making process. So really gave us certainty in the state of Iowa when we were investing in the state that we were going to receive a reasonable rate of return for the investment that we made. So in 2012, late 2011, early 2012, I think everybody in the room here is familiar with the production tax credit cycle. It was a time in the U.S. where, number one, we had Solyndra that defaulted on the government guaranteed loan on the solar side, and we're running through an expiration time period on the PTCs, which then allowed our owners to look at the opportunity to invest Berkshire Hathaway Energy Capital into the unregulated renewables business. And that's really when BHE Wind was formed as part of BHE Renewables. And we currently have 6 projects in operation or under construction at this point that total 1,153 megawatts. So we have 2 projects in California, one in the Panhandle of Texas, one in northeastern Kansas, one in Illinois that's operational, and the one we'll talk about here in a little bit under construction now and moving into the last phases of commissioning is the Grand Prairie project, 400 megawatt Grand Prairie project in Polk County, Nebraska. And so one thing that we've recently seen, and I would tell you just over the last few weeks, this presentation has morphed a little bit as I've really wanted to communicate my message to this group and how we need to deal with economic development impacts to rural Nebraska. And, you know, as we in this room are in the business and developers, we continue to see local opposition to renewables projects. And, you know, while projects may be opposed for a number of different reasons, including perceived nuisance, health effects, environmental issues, and, you know, I would say now even more stridently, probably just the whole tax subsidy issue, you know, we need to be able to communicate effectively the economic impacts that these projects really do deliver to the local economies. We've seen, as I indicated, a steady stream of opposition. I've been talking with a number of folks here and a number of our constituents in the audience. But we recently developed a project and permitted a project in Illinois that actually we went through 42 local hearings before we received our conditional use permits in that state. It was just an unbelievable process to go through, very well organized opposition. And I would tell you the one thing that carried the day really was the local economic development and the support that we had from the county supervisors, number one, and the school districts, number two, with the economic development impacts. When we look at the key points, I think the one thing when we look at the second bullet here that we really need to do in order to carry the day with the message is to accurately estimate the local impacts and really develop a good plan that will communicate that to the general public. I would say that as we look at today, thank goodness it's election day, right? I mean, we're finally getting through all the different rhetoric, all of the stories, the truths, the untruths that come out. And that's sort of the same thing that you see on the opposition side for wind. But the one thing I would say that really is the hard impacts is the economic development. As we look at the third bullet, rural renewable energy development, I think we do have a great story to tell. And when we look at how we tell that story, I think it's key that we look at how we do promote it. And I see sort of the opposition today very similar to the opposition, and I will go back to specifically Hope County, and Mike Zakrzewski's here in one of our key landowners that we had. I really told a great story just over the last couple of weeks. When we look at what happened with center pivots, maybe 30 years ago in the area, there was people who were opposed to, they're big, they're ugly, they're changing the landscape, and they're noisy. And, we can draw some of the same direct parallels with opposition to wind at this point in time, but just look at what center pivots have done for the local economy up in rural Nebraska. And as we look at the impacts that renewables projects can have, I think it's really on the same order. As we look at how we've developed the project in Hope County, we're able to place the turbines in the corners of areas. And, for some of the simple math, if we look at it, if we have 200 bushel corn, and I've done a number of different calculations for folks, if you take a half an acre actually out of production with the access road and the footprint of the turbine, that's about the largest I've ever seen. So, you end up with 100 bushel of corn that's actually produced from that half acre. And say if you have $5 corn, we'll keep the math easy. That's $500 of gross revenues before any inputs on that land. And when you look at one turbine that's multiple thousands of dollars, really is a great story for value-added agriculture in the state. So how do we look at the development of the economic impacts to the local communities? The one tool that I found that's very useful is a tool that's developed through the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, which is called the Jobs and Economic Development Impact Model, or JEDI model. It's really utilized throughout the United States to estimate the number of jobs and economic impacts that can reasonably be supported by renewables projects. The JEDI models really are commonly used throughout county and state decision makers, public utility commissioners, and different project owners and developers. So I don't know, is anybody in the audience, show of hands, is anybody familiar with JEDI and utilized it before? All right, so we've got a few folks. So it really is, it's an Excel tool, and you saw the link up there. I didn't mention that before, but really it's a good tool. You can utilize, this is actually just some of the basic information that's loaded if you go out to the website. Very easy to use, can enter the year of construction, project size, the turbine size, how many turbines, and then the cost inputs. As we look at the model, there are basic model loaded information, but to get good user information, it does allow you to change the specific inputs to be tailored to your individual project, number one, location, number two, so that you're calculating the correct property taxes and local impact. So really pretty user-friendly interface as we look at the inputs. So that was on the construction side. Again, this is an area where is basic default loaded information as it's put into the model. Can get as detailed as you want, or utilize the general inputs from construction costs, go all the way down from the equipment costs, the construction costs, and builds all the way from the labor and miscellaneous for the project input. So very specific to the projects that we're building in your area. Additionally, I think one area that the JEDI model provides very good information is on the annual operating and maintenance costs. This is an area where it does provide, again, basic default information, but gets very, very specific, if you're able to enter your own information and how it determines the total O&M cost, number one, but then the ongoing jobs impact. And I would say, as we look at this, we were real pleased with the results. We actually, as we look at our projects, we like to underestimate and over-deliver. And I think when we look at how it compares, the JEDI model compares to Grand Prairie and Holt County, I think you'll see that that's actually the case. So this is the last screen of the inputs from the JEDI model. Really just covers other inputs, which would be landowner payments, property taxes, and then any other project financing impacts that you might see from the project. So what does all of this do then? As we look at the model outputs, that really is put together when they look at the calculations through NREL, through a number of different interviews with people in the industry, and they continue to update the model and to revise the outputs. But for this specific project and our specific project, I would say the one thing you have to do with any model is really dig into the details and the calculations of how you get to the output for what I think is very important is the local spend. And this model, as we look at the local spend, in this case, would indicate that there would have been, $39.5 million of local spend. Now, this is not necessarily related to Holt County and our Grand Prairie project. This is a general basic project load from the JEDI model. But of that $39.5 million, when this model calculates, it looks at sort of local impacts across the entire manufacturing chain. So it's not only what would have been in that local construction county, but also where turbines would have been manufactured and the local impact of jobs in those areas. So from our perspective, we had to dig a little bit deeper into the outputs. And as we look at the JEDI model for Holt County and Grand Prairie, that model would have said there roughly would have been, over $100 million worth of local spend that would have taken place. But that would have included, all of the turbine supply manufacturing in Colorado, transformer manufacturing where they're manufactured. And as we dig in deeper to the model, there's an area that it is called the local demand, and that's really what we like to look at as the very localized impact to the county where the project ends up being built. And when we look at the JEDI estimate for Grand Prairie, effectively it was about $7.3 million. In actuality, we ended up with a local spend of about $7.7 million. Of that, construction services was about $2.3 million, construction materials about $3.8 million, food and housing about $1.4 million, and then a couple $100,000 of local actual hires and salaries. The one area I think that the JEDI model does a very good job of estimation is, number one, the creation of construction jobs, and then also on the O&M jobs. So as we look at the construction jobs, we really had a 2-cycle build for the Grand Prairie project. We actually began construction in July of 2015 and carried that through into 2016. And in total, we had a peak of construction employees of 347 on the project site. And when you look at that sort of on an annualized, levelized basis of full-time employee equivalents over a 2,080-hour working year, equates very well, I think, to the 194 that would have been estimated from the JEDI model, from an actual full employment for 1 year. Then, as we move into the property taxes and on-site jobs, specifically, if we look at the on-site jobs, the JEDI model, would have given us an output of 18. In fact, in Hope County, we will create 25 new jobs in that area for that project. And property taxes estimated in the JEDI model of 1.6 million, where we will see, again, very good result, I think, from 1.8 to 2.2, depending upon the final levy amounts that come out of Polk County. And then as we look at payments to landowners, estimated through the model about 1.2 million, where we'll be making, $2.5 million on an annual basis. And so that really, when we look at that revenue and how that goes back into the county, if we look at the property taxes, effectively 26% goes directly to the whole county general fund, about 72% to the school districts, and a couple percent to the fire districts in the local township. So, there's not too many other businesses in rural Nebraska where you'll actually see that direct and immediate impact into the local economies. The one thing, if we would go back and look at the JEDI model a little bit, it talks about are really the induced impacts of the jobs created and the economic benefit. When opponents look at the modeling efforts and really the induced impacts of jobs, that it's really pretty soft. But what I always like to do is I like to go back to the first project I ever built in 2003, and I think every project has its own story. But that was built during a time at the expiration again of a production tax credit. We're bringing the project online. It was December 31st. Of 2003, I was actually out on the project site, and we commissioned the last turbine. It was actually at 10:59, so we had an hour and 61 minutes to spare before the expiration of the production tax credit at that point in time. So, but really, I think the important thing is, that next day on January 1st, we had a project celebration at a local establishment, and the owner of that establishment was a disabled American veteran. He had just bought the project actually about 2 months before, or bought the establishment about 2 months before we started construction in July. And when he did his diligence, he was sitting there telling me, I looked at the financials of this business over the last 5 years, and he thought, well, if I could just do that business, on a going forward basis, I can make a go of it, and I could establish this business in Shaler, Iowa, is where this was at. And he looked at me and he said, he said, over the last 6 months, we've done that same amount of business that this restaurant did over the last 5 years. We did that in the last 6 months. And that's really the local impact that these projects have. And I would say, I've built 21 projects in my career so far, and I would just encourage, if you're developers, if you're owners, if you're operators, get those local stories, get them out, because those really are key as to, when we talk about induced benefits, those are really what I see as you can make a direct impact on others in the community. And so in summary, when we look at the increasing project opposition, again, I think it's critical to get the message out. And just as I said, as we look at what are the stories, what can we do to educate legislators in local communities, I think it's really key to keep the economic development impacts at the forefront of the discussions that we have. And it's good communication and the delivery that we need to educate really the 90% of the people who run informed. I mean, there can be a very small, vocal opposition that can muddy the waters, and I think, as you look at project development, as you look at moving into operations, I think it's key to work with the local stakeholders, government officials, school officials, really to get that message out. And as I would indicate, I think there are few, if any, other industries, in the state right now that can have the immediate and direct impact on Nebraska's rural ag economy. I hesitate to give this last bit of information because it's going to date me a little bit, but I graduated from North Platte High School in 1980, and anybody in the population in 1980 was 24,500 people. Anybody care to hazard a guess what the population was in 2015? It had grown by a whopping 200 people, so it was 24,700. And I would not even say that North Platte is rural Nebraska, but when we look at 25 jobs, it might not sound like much. When we're sitting here in Lincoln, in Omaha, in Des Moines, where I'm from, but when we look at Holt County and the ability to keep local kids there, if they wanted to stay on the farm, if they want to move back, I would say that's a direct and immediate and substantial impact to the area. So I would just encourage you to, and again, find those stories and continue to promote the ability to create jobs and that local economic impact.
Okay. Greg, do you want to? We've got time for a couple of questions. If you want to ask Tom questions about his projects and things going on in his company, let's do that right now.
Do you have any suggestions on areas where we could be developing new businesses in Nebraska to help feed the wind supply chain? Are there things that we could be doing in Nebraska that we're not doing right now to fill that supply chain?
Yeah, so can everybody hear the question okay? Okay, so the question was, are there any suggestions for things that we could be doing in Nebraska right now to sell the supply chain and really to help support the business? And I think, as I look at it, again, I think it's finding the right regulatory balance, between whether it's, private businesses like ours, whether it's public power, and whether it's the off-takers. I think it's really finding that balance. And that's what we look for, not only at Mid-American Energy Company, but at Berkshire Hathaway Energy Company. I mean, I think you have to have a good regulatory structure. I think you have to have, a good result for the customers so that they're getting very cost-effective energy. And then, the investors in the state have to be able to earn a reasonable rate of return on their investment. And so, I think as we look at Nebraska, I think those are the key areas that we would look at.
Yeah, but what about businesses that supply your wind farms? Are there businesses there we could be developing to provide, so that we're providing more of the things you use in the state?
Yeah, so the question is, are there other businesses that could be developed that could supply us more of the things that we use? I would say, yes, we look at sort of an ongoing operations. I think it will also come down to, we don't necessarily perform our own balance of plant electrical work. So it's finding, I think it's going to sort of even trickle down from that standpoint is training qualified employees on the electrical front. So it's electricians, it could be, other mechanics, and then, in Illinois, I can tell you, we have one piece of equipment that continually seems to fail on one of our turbine technologies that, we now have a local machine shop that's manufacturing, rebuilt, revised, and redesigned pitch motors for a specific technology that, we're able to, help that local machine shop, but then, they're providing us a very cost-effective product. And so I think it's really, as you move into operations, it's finding those types of opportunities.
We have one back here.
Thank you for your presentation.
Thank you for your presentation. My name's Larry Flowers. I'm from Colorado. I worked at NREL during the JEDI development. It was developed as a sort of simplified method using in-plan. And in-plan, of course, is used all over the country on any kind of economic development. in rural areas, and so it's a pretty proven tool. But I just want to pile on to what you said about the indirect and induced jobs. They're 2 to 3 times the direct jobs, and they do have a huge impact on the local community. Our personal experience in Colorado, our first big wind farm was down in Lamar, Colorado. Southeastern Colorado which was a Dust Bowl area back in the days, and that town was dying. And the county commissioner, John Stolp, would end up becoming the agriculture secretary for Colorado. I used to take him around to other counties around the West to talk about what the first wind project of 104 megawatts did for Lamar, the town of Lamar and the Prowers County. And he basically, the bottom line was, it saved our town. Not only the jobs that kept young people there, which was really the heart and soul of rural America, is keeping young people in the rural communities, but also the indirect and induced jobs to all the businesses, the daycare centers, the cleaners, the restaurants and so forth, that kept those businesses in play for years and years to come. So I just want to pile on to your comment that is, the direct jobs are important, but the induced and indirect jobs are even more important to local community welfare.
Yeah, no, appreciate that very much. And I mean, those are just harder to quantify, but I think they are important. I just, again, we go back to sort of my own personal experience. The second project we ever built actually was located in an area where there was a consolidated school district, actually was set to shut down probably within the next 2 to 3 years. And now that school district is still up and operating. They've actually, because of the wind project, been able to expand, and they're moving students into that area as opposed to shutting down. So really does have that impact and direct in the local areas.
Dave Ridge, Nebraska Public Power District. Yesterday there was a lot of discussion regarding the exporting of wind out of Nebraska. The challenge is all the states around us have very good wind. Where does BHE or Mid-America stand on developing DC transmission lines that will allow the exporting of wind from the Midwest to the East Coast, where recently an offshore wind was built, the PPA was signed at about 17 times higher price than what we're seeing here in Nebraska, starting at $244 a megawatt hour, escalating at 3.5% a year.
Yeah, so I would tell you we've looked at a number of the DC opportunities, and we continue to evaluate them. Whether that's the clean line from northwest Iowa down from Oklahoma to the TVA area, and then there's also a southerly track. We know the folks at Clean Line, we know what they're doing, and we continue to evaluate that as an economic opportunity. The one thing, again, this is sort of my personal view. So if that answers your question, I can't go into any more detail about what we're looking at, but we continue to evaluate those, and we do see that as one area to move energy from the Midwest to the East Coast and maybe the Southeast. I think the one thing, from my personal level, when I look at what's sort of stifled that, I think it was a great concept when it was developed, maybe 6, 7, 8 years ago. But when we look at the technologies of the wind turbines, where I think one of the original ideas was just moving wind to Chicago, right, from Iowa to Chicago. Well, my project in Illinois right now is a 42% capacity factor, with a 6.5 meter per second wind, and I've got an 8.5 meter per second wind in Iowa that's delivering with older technology, maybe a 32, 34%. So I think, just that increase sort of stymied the original Clean Line thought that you could move the high wind to say Chicago. But I think as you look at the power prices, David, specifically that you're talking about, I think that's a great opportunity to continue that discussion on the DC tie line.